All right, well, folks, very happy to have you join the rest of us. We're having a nice private conversation out here. I don't know if you guys can hear it where you were. Why don't we start off with each of our guests introducing themselves one by one, starting at the end of the row, if you wouldn't mind.
Hi, I'm Bret Weinstein. Evolution. Thank you for not protesting. I'm an evolutionary biologist who, it is increasingly clear, does not know when to shut his mouth. And let's see, I thought I would tell you something that has not been widely discussed. I was a bat biologist in graduate school. I chased fruit bats around tropical forests. It was a very different gig than what happened at Evergreen.
So I'm Heather Hying. Bret and I are married and recently resigned from Evergreen. I'm also an evolutionary biologist with a long-standing interest in how to educate people such that we can move forward into a more stable and just and sustainable society with the toolkit of evolutionary biology. And my little story that isn't widely out there is that when I was doing my graduate research in Madagascar, I was attacked by a lemur. And it took quite a few days to learn that, in fact, lemurs don't have rabies. So I was able to consider my mortality while being stitched up without anesthetic by a doctor in the nearby town.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Robin Johnson, and I am an equity consultant here in Portland. And just to clarify, I was having a conversation with my niece, and she was like, "Oh, Auntie, you're an equity consultant, so you're in banking and finance." I was like, No, I'm in the social justice type of equity work. And so I do that work across the country, really helping organizations to essentially develop the strategic plan elements of their equity plan.
My name is Michael Parkhurst. I live here in Portland, and I can't touch the bit by a lemur story. I got nothing for that. I now work at Meyer Memorial Trust, which is one of the larger private foundations in Oregon. So we donate money for a variety of good social causes across the state of Oregon. I work on housing issues with folks all over the state of Oregon. And as you may know, diversity, equity, and inclusion have been increasingly high priorities at Meyer. So a big part of my job is to work with folks about how does that show up in your work, and how can we further that agenda, and what does that really mean anyway? Before that, I squandered my youth studying and teaching political philosophy and related things like constitutional law, and a little bit about civil rights and things like that.
All right, well, thank you very much. Yeah, I've never been bit by a lemur either, but when I got out here and was staying at my buddy Shiloh's place here, I did get ambushed by the most monstrous centipede I'd ever seen. Is that a thing in Oregon? Because we don't have those things in LA. And I screamed like a girl. I'm just gonna be honest with you. And I threw a shoe. Okay. Well, all right. So let's jump into, I think, what's going to be, well, sort of the fundamental question here. Well, a fundamental question and the logical place to start. How do we define identity politics? And as an attachment to that, is there a definite sort of moral dimension to identity politics? In other words, what is identity politics, and is it something that is always or usually good, always or usually bad, or is it like so many other things where the devil is in the details? And so whoever wants to take a stab at starting us off with that question, go ahead and jump right in. See, I just throw up a jump ball. I went to see this. I can always call on names, but yeah.
So I would say that identity politics does have a certain pejorative connotation to it, but if we put that aside, I think the core of identity politics is a strategic political approach that places one's identity, either phenotype or some sort of characteristic of people, ahead of values, beliefs, and ideology with respect to how one groups themselves. What was the second part of the question?
Is there a fundamental moral dimension to identity politics?
Well, I would say that there is a dichotomy that one can imagine a politics in which people are loyal to the larger group. In other words, that there is a certain patriotism to the nation, and then there's debate about how to administer the nation, and that when one signs up for an identity group that is smaller than the nation, you're effectively placing that identity in conflict with the patriotic allegiance to the larger whole. So I would say there is a moral dimension, but I don't want to caricature it. There is a question about whether or not the nation is serving the interests of all of the people within it, and if it is, then surely there is an obligation that comes along with that to be loyal to the nation that is serving all those people. To the extent that a nation falls down on that obligation, it might be very natural to default to some entity that can identify itself and look out for its own interests.
Yeah. Anybody else like to weigh in on that topic?
I guess I'm curious about this idea of in your framing around an identity group, so whether as a woman, as a black person, or as a black woman, if I'm centering that perspective in my political identity and therefore connecting with those groups around that shared identity, are you saying that that's taking away from the larger patriotic? I just want to understand it.
So let's look at it from two perspectives. If I advance an ideological belief in equality, let's say, I argue that equality is an essential feature of the functioning of the nation. Now, it happens that I may be part of a group that I want to have an equal shot at the well-being in society, and so my advocating equality does ultimately serve my interests in that regard. But it's not that I'm looking for equality for me, it's that I actually want equality across the board, and that equality across the board will naturally bring everybody into the well-being that society generates. So there are two ways to approach it, which is I'm trying to get my group to that place, and the other thing is I'm advocating for something that will bring all groups equally to that place. So those are different, because to the extent that one is centering one's own identity, phenotypic or otherwise, what happens is if you get your interests served, then the tendency is, well, then mission accomplished, rather than actually the mission hasn't been accomplished till everybody has gotten access.
Yeah, that's helpful for me to hear you frame it that way, and I think that I just want to offer up my perspective around identity politics and how, for me, there is real value in being able to center my perspective as a more marginalized person in our communities, and that there's value for me in being able to name, as a woman of color, these are campaign issues, political issues, policy issues that I need to advocate for very intentionally. And part of that is to decenter, I guess, again, dominant culture society, because dominant culture hasn't served me, and I think it hasn't served a lot of those of us who are in marginalized spaces. And I think that there's real value in being able to caucus or have affinity groups in those areas, because I know I've learned more about even the diversity of perspective in my own community by being able to centralize around that perspective, and then being able to come to the larger conversation around what do we share, what do we have in common with folks who maybe do identify with a more dominant culture.
Robin, I think that you touched on a very interesting point, and I'd like for us to expand on that a little bit. Part of what you said was that there's real value in sort of decentralizing our focus from around the nation, if I'm getting it correctly, and to sort of recenter it around, I guess, those groups to which we are more directly connected, because certain issues pertain, and certain challenges maybe pertain more directly to them. What I'd like to ask the panel, generally speaking, is there a need when confronting issues that have a particular impact on particular groups to sort of frame them that way, to center our analysis of these problems around our identification with groups that are being impacted by a particular issue. So if somebody who hasn't spoken would like to take the lead on that, please go ahead.
Yeah, and I guess before I jump into full rant mode, I should issue the standard disclaimer that I'm not representing Meyer tonight. I'm not expressing Meyer's official position. Also a disclaimer, I don't think I'm an expert on identity politics. I haven't had the deep engagement with sort of the business end of what you call identity politics that the two of you have had down there. But I think it was Justice Roberts who said the way to stop discriminating based on race is to stop discriminating based on race. And Supreme Court justices over the years have said a lot of really dumb things, and I think that was a particularly dumb thing to say. If the problems in America are thoroughly racialized, and thoroughly structured around gender and other relationships of subordination and oppression, the solutions have to pay attention to that. And to make this really real and really concrete, if you haven't read the New York Times article that came out maybe a month ago, based on the research of Raj Chetty, who's with his researchers is tapping into this really deep database of longitudinal life outcomes for different folks and really digging into, they were born here of these parents, of this occupations, and they ended up here in these neighborhoods at this income level. What they showed was really stunning. The outcomes for black men are horrifying and appalling, and you cannot explain that away based on class or some kind of inherent characteristics they have. Something really peculiar is going on there. And if you're not paying attention to race and foregrounding that, you'll never understand it, and it means you don't understand America.
Whoa! You got a fan, I see. Would anybody else like to pick up on that?
Yeah, I would push back on that a bit and say we have to investigate the premise that all of America is suffering from racial and sexual bias. And with regard to I don't know the particular study that you're talking about, I have actually little doubt that there are at least comparable studies, if not that one, that are accurate. And that we know, for instance, that incarceration rates are unequal between black men, Latino men, and white men. And there is little doubt in anyone's head that that is due in part to bias, that policing and courts have bias. But with regard to incarceration rates, we also know that men and women have wildly different incarceration rates. And no one is talking about bias with regard to incarceration rates. So there is bias, for sure. There's discrimination against particular groups, both historic and present. It is hard to tease apart what current bias there is from historic bias. And there are always other explanations also. And so the solution making needs to be representative of the understanding that to propose just, and this is the scientist in me, to the degree that I ascribe to identity politics, it's scientist, right? That we need to make sure that we have a complete solution set of hypotheses on the table as to why there is an apparent inequity. And there is definite inequity in society. There is current bias, there's historic bias, but some things that look like inequity, I would say, aren't. And some things that look like inequity are, but they are now catching up and becoming equal because we have actually put the policies in place in order to fix them.
I want to clarify something. I have a feeling it will haunt us all evening if we don't do it. I don't think anybody here is arguing that to the extent that you have a genuine inequity, and we have plenty of them, that it doesn't need to be addressed. But if we look at, for example, the civil rights movement, I don't think anybody can argue that it was not well enough focused on the special obstacles faced by people of color. But the objective was Martin Luther King's dream, in which everyone would be judged based on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. That objective does not center anyone in particular. The point is, we will be done at the point that we reach the phase where people are judged based on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. So that is not identity politics at the level of the objective, rather than an objective that is racialized itself. And I would argue the thing to shoot for is Martin Luther King's objective. And the thing that has troubled me absolutely the most in the last year is watching that objective be derided as insufficient or naive or foolish or something like that. So this is, I think, what we're really up against, is a tension between that noble objective, which we never reached, but nonetheless, is it a failure? Are we now agreed that we should substitute something else for it? Or do we believe that we need to pursue that objective until we reach it, that's where I would come out.
I want to pick up on a formulation that you offered a little bit earlier, which ties into the tail end of Heather's comments a moment ago. And I'll preface it with this. Some of you may be familiar with the political scientist Mark Lilla. He wrote a book called The Once and Future Liberal, where he sort of, speaking obviously from his perspective, he laments the decline of liberal politics owing to the excess of identity politics. That's his perspective. But interestingly, he doesn't so much argue that we need to get rid of identity politics. What he argues is that we need to embrace a type of identity politics which calls first and foremost with an identification with the nation, and then downstream from that, to identify with our cultural and ethnic groups, parties, and whatever other categories there might be. So my question to the panel is, does it necessarily have to detract from, or does it either necessarily or tend to have to detract from our commitment to the nation for us to have a pre-existing commitment to our cultural group that animates our politics in kind of the way that Robin described earlier? Do we have to sacrifice some degree of our allegiance to the broader society to really commit to the interests of our particular cultural group? And once again, whoever wants to jump on that can go ahead.
I would say that we can't actually maximize all of our values at once, right? So we probably do have to prioritize, even if we feel like the act of prioritization is subverting what we want. And for me, I don't think nation is the place to stop. So we will find in-group, out-group divisions. We will become tribal. This is what social organisms do, right? There is no way around that. But as humans, with the most culture, with the most software layer of any organisms on the planet, we should aspire, I think, to think about our shared humanity first. Think of humans, think of the entire planet and humanity first, and then focus on the individual. And only after, in engaging with people, thinking about what they share with us as humans and how they differ from us as individuals, should we go into the analysis of in-group, out-group differences. And furthermore, I would say then that because we're talking about populations of men and women, of African Americans and European Americans and Latino Americans and such, that the variance within those populations will always be far greater than the variance between them. And that means that while there are average differences between groups and interests and such, that our focus on our common humanity and our focus on our individual differences can, in fact, rise above the tribal differences.
Does anybody else want to pick up on that topic? Does having an allegiance to a particular cultural group mean that you have to devalue your allegiance to the country or to the wider body of humanity?
Yeah, I think this is where, I get nervous in this conversation, because I think there's a line of thinking, which I think Heather expressed in a way, and Lilla, I think, is on this train, and some of the other essays I read this afternoon have suggested this, that part of the critique of identity politics is we need to just sort of suppress talking about our differences or put that aside, or we know trans folks have certain issues and we'll get to them later after we're all free and equal. And I don't think that's satisfactory if you're a trans person. I don't think that's going to be okay, and I don't believe we'll get to those issues unless we foreground them and talk about them.
I don't think anybody's saying that. I don't think we're not talking about people's issues. We're talking about setting an agenda. I'm not thrilled with nation as the place where that gets set either. But nonetheless, we have to set a collective agenda. And to the extent that some people are disenfranchised, it has to be addressed, which means it has to be discussed. But the question is the objective going to be made particular to identities, or is the objective going to be something like equality of opportunity?
Well, I think for me, these things are connected together. I just watched last night the video from Milwaukee where the police accosted the basketball player and ended up tasing him because he wasn't super cooperative and deferential. He was insufficiently deferential, and he got tackled and tased. And as Heather said, I'm a human being. Sterling Brown is a human being. And I'm like, that is steeply messed up. I'm really appalled to see this happen. That would not have happened to me. I just guarantee you, the Milwaukee police would not do that.
Well, I don't think you know that. I was in a protest in Berkeley many years ago, and I was knocked to the ground flat by a cop who didn't like my politics. I mean, it was just very clear. The fact that I was protesting was unacceptable. What I looked like didn't matter. Now, I'm not saying that the incident wasn't motivated by race. What I would say, though, is we don't know. We cannot know, because there's only one way to do it, and it actually runs afoul of identity politics very directly at the moment. The way you figure out whether or not race is playing a role there is you do a scientific analysis at the level of populations, and you find out if that incident or the severity of it is disproportionately likely if you have certain characteristics rather than others. Now, what Heather and I saw at Evergreen was a direct challenge to the idea of using science rather than anecdote in order to formulate policy. So our students, actually, we had a student of color who was, during the riots, walking across campus and was berated for studying science because science itself was understood to be just another mechanism of people inflicting oppression on other people using tools that that sanitized it. So my point would be, if you're going to address a problem like that, and it really is due to race, the way to discover it is through a rigorous scientific process, and then you know when you've cured it too. If we do this at the level of anecdote, there are always going to be anecdotes that one would be tempted to imagine arise because of X, Y, and Z process, but you really have no idea until you've compared them.
I'm sorry, Michael, did you want to respond to that very quickly?
Yeah, with respect, that analysis has been done and is done as deeply every single there's a very short book that I don't go around saying every single American should read this book, but every single American should read this book. It's The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. It does exactly what you're asking for.
Yeah, so I think there's a very interesting empirical conversation to be had here, and you guys would probably be well equipped to have that conversation. If you don't mind, I would like to shift over to sort of picking up on a tack that Michael introduced, and to put it against the formulation that Bret and Heather, you guys offered a moment ago, by introducing it through Robert F. Kennedy quote. Robert Kennedy said that, well, I may be about to botch it, but you guys know the line. He said something along the lines of people think of things that think of things that are and ask why. I think of things that never were and ask why not. And that's a very inspiring quote for many people, but some people look at that line and think, well, how naive is that? That just means that you're living in a fantasy. Things never were, in many cases, because they can't be, and high-minded idealists and liberals or what have you have a tendency to try to make things happen that aren't grounded in any sort of practical viability. The reason I offer that quote is because Bret and Heather, you guys mentioned the importance of centering our analysis and our engagement with political issues around a focus on the individual, as opposed to these, different cultural groups. And Mike's response to that seemed to be, in part, that there's a real degree to which you cannot separate the two. So my question here is there anything we can gather from history to suggest that we really can transcend the sorts of group bonds that we have that sometimes become so intense that they result in the sort of episodes and debacles that we've seen, well, obviously that two of you can attest to and that others can attest to, where identity politics seems to metastasize into extreme behavior. But is it even possible for us to get beyond that in the way that you two are describing? Or is Michael got a point in saying that these things, for better or worse, are connected, and maybe we need to just deal with that the way it is and find a way to improve it where it's at?
I think we need better narratives. The narratives that work historically for humans have been enemy narratives. And it's, if the aliens arrived, we'd all group together and we'd figure it out, right? We'd become human. We'd become human together. And then if we beat them off, then we'd go back into our tribes. There must be, there are other universal human stories out there. Hero's Journey is a good example of one. There must be some new good narratives for us to discover that we can move forward with, that can become stable enough that it's what we're telling our children, that they become the myths of the new world, that create unity and hope and actual progress for everyone. I don't know what those narratives are. We don't have them yet. That I think is what we need. So I can't point to anything in the past, but I can say that I think that we can do better than enemy narratives. And identity politics inherently is an in-group, out-group narrative that creates other, that creates enemy. And that this is inherently divisive.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I think I disagree with the idea that in identity politics are necessary. I think that there can be in-group, out-grouping. I don't think that necessarily means there needs to be an enemy narrative. I think that it's really interesting. I'm very curious about this idea about us collectively being in touch with our humanity, and I think that this idea of not addressing the way in which oppression has operated in our country, and if I think very specifically about racism, and how it's operated in our country, that really by not addressing those who have been marginalized by racism and institutional, systemic racism, marginalization, and oppression, then we're actually denying our humanity. By not acknowledging and by not unpacking it, we're allowing ourselves to continue to be inhumane towards one another. And it's until we address that and unpack it, we're going to continue to gloss over the fact that for generations, communities have been marginalized and oppressed. And there is a realistic lived experience that is in-group, out-group. There are folks who have and have not. There are folks who have access and those who do not. And that's a real experience. And to frame it around, well, we're left inherently with enemy narratives, I think denies us the opportunity for all of us, folks of color, white folks, LGBTQ folks, straight folks, to really find, again, like, where are our commonalities, where is our shared humanity? And by not unpacking that, and I don't know, subscribing to that idea of like enemy narratives, for me personally, just isn't sitting well.
What I've seen, both from evolutionary theory and in other animals, and then our very real lived experience, and what I was watching in our country for the last several years, is that identity politics begets identity politics. And that when someone in modern, say, identity politics space, if a straight white guy approaches a group and is told that because of immutable characteristics, because of characteristics that he was born with, because he was born with now its original sin, he cannot be part of the group without being a second-class citizen. He can be called an ally, but he's going to have to be subservient. There's a good chance that he's going to go with the people who are saying, come here, right? That the rise of white nationalist identity politics is happening hand in hand with this. It is dangerous, and this identity politics, I am sure, and yes, this is based on anecdotes from so many people I've talked to, but also from theory, that Trump rode this wave to victory. He rode the divisive nature of identity politics such that a lot of people who were feeling like, yes, they were imagining a history that was built on oppression, that they thought they wanted to go back to, but at the point that they were also being told that they were seeing stories that said to them, oh, I'm not even going to be included in the future, like the future is not for me, that is not a good look for us. That is not a good look for those of us who are, I'm making giant assumptions here, but I'm in Portland, who are left of center, significantly left of center, mostly politically, If we actually want to move forward and include everyone, we shouldn't be sending the message that there are people who will be second-class citizens in the future. And I say that knowing that there have been second-class citizens in the past, and that acknowledging that is something that we should do and that we must do, but that, and both Bret and I have said this before, but that what modern identity politics looks like it's doing is not seeking an equal future, but actually seeking to reverse the tables of oppression.
Now, there are a couple of different directions we can go in here, and part of what I would like to talk about a little bit as we have time is this question of whether or not identity politics, in the way that we're talking about it here, fueled sort of a right-wing identity politic response in terms of the context of the rise of Trump. But before we get there, I want to key in on this concept of narrative, because I think, and I hope the audience can see too, that there are definitely conceptual differences amongst our panelists here. But I think that there's a lot of agreement too in terms of what a lot of the material problems actually are. And so this, in a certain sense, this conversation about identity politics is also kind of a conversation about conversation itself. And Heather, you pointed to that when you mentioned the need for new narratives. But Robin, I think that this is something that you're also concerned with too. And one thing that we were interested in was a line from your bio. And if you don't mind, I'll just read it very quickly. And I would ask for you guys to pick up on it. It's a lot darker over here than I realized. Let me see if I can find my, it's not like flashlight. Okay, boom. So it's like the new, smartphone's like the new Swiss Army knives. It's like, what is it? There's a line in your bio, Robin, where you're answering the question, well, what is the question that guides your work? And you say, what does it take to move the hearts and minds of folks across diverse backgrounds to buy into the living reality of an equitable society? And I can't help but think that that's a question that we're all kind of grasping with, albeit from different starting points. So, Heather, I mean, you remarked that it's kind of difficult to know what the proper narrative that would serve as an answer to that question is, but I'd like for you guys to try anyway a little bit if you have any instincts. So, I mean, Robin, I just read the line from your bio. I'd love to know your thoughts about that, but then anybody else who wants to jump in on this question of what kind of narrative can achieve this optimal outcome where we can all come together in the problems we disagree on. What are your instincts about how we might get there?
I think that it's a really fantastic question for us to all be wrestling with, and I do think that there is something around how can we capture hearts and minds to move towards a more socially just experience for all of us. And I think that there's an element around, I guess just a little bit of a story. Just recently, my mom's white and my dad is Black and Indigenous, and I took my mom out for a birthday lunch, and we were talking, and she mentioned something to me. It really did not land well, but I was glad we were in the conversation. And she said, we were just talking about kind of moving forward as a society, and at some point, like, we're not going to be able to abide by status quo, and there's going to be, we were talking about kind of an uprising of the people, and she said, I'm really worried that as a white person, people of color are going to come after me. And I was like, it really, again, didn't land well with me, and I was like, I'm really bothered by that statement, that you would think that people of color would come after you. And I was like, in the spaces and places that I navigate as a person of color, I've never been in a conversation where the strategy or the tactic has been to, as folks who are coming from an oppressed place, to then oppress our oppressor. I know that there are camps out there, I'm not saying they don't exist, but that's never been the dynamic or the conversations I've been in around how do we move the hearts and minds. And I think that it's really important, and again, I think that this is also partly why the enemy narrative doesn't sit well with me, because that's just not what I've seen. What I've experienced for myself and from folks in my community is that we want our perspective to be seen and heard, to be considered, to be a part of the solution, and that when we continue to center kind of, again, dominant culture, then those voices tend to be, again, continue to be marginalized. And I think that there's real value in the tools that got us to the place we are at right now are not going to be the same tools that dismantle the systems of oppression that we're operating in. And I think that there's real value in us really exploring what those new tools are and what they need to be framed around. And I'm truly curious around how identity politics helps shape what those other tools look like, because again, our perspectives have not been centered and not really a part of a lot of, driving campaign, driving strategy, driving politics.
I feel some need, I'm a little thrown actually, that we're struggling for some historical example that would suggest that we can overcome bigotry. Because, I mean, for one thing, we are that example right here, right now, right? I am not arguing that society is equally open to people. It is heavily biased. At the very least, it is heavily biased by zip code, which is heavily correlated with race. But are we getting better at accepting each other? We absolutely are. I mean, I'm closing in on 50. There were no gay kids in my high school. What are the chances? Right? There were gay kids in my high school, but they weren't out, and there's a reason they weren't out, which is that they couldn't be out. Now, they could be out, no problem. Everybody's gotten over it. I don't know if it was Will and Grace, I don't know if it was Queen, what it was. It was something. People realized, oh, say again? It was Queen. Well, I actually think it had a lot to do with it, because the thing about Freddie Mercury was he was singing about love, and it was really cool, and then you realize maybe he wasn't singing about what you thought he was singing about, and that reached people. It told them actually love is kind of the same thing, right? It doesn't matter if you're gay or straight, it feels the same, and that made us human to each other. So I see a lot of hope in what we've accomplished, and the last thing I want to see us do is upend what we are accomplishing before we reach the goal of actually making society equally open to us. So please just consider even recent decades have not been nearly as open as we are now. I testified in front of the House Oversight Committee, I guess it was 2 days ago. This is a committee that is, of course, run by Republicans. They invited a black person to testify because they wanted to hear it, and a Republican Congress inviting a black academic to talk about this issue, that's progress too. We're nowhere near where we need to go, but I believe we are making headway, and what I would like to see us do is get to the parts that are easier to deny. Why are zip codes distributed the way they are? What effect does that have on the way that people have access to schooling? What effect does the fact that we collect property taxes locally and then allocate it to schools so that schools in neighborhoods that don't have very much money have poor schools and tend to reinforce those patterns over history? Those are the things we need to be talking about. But are we getting better at being used to each other and our differences? I really think we are.
Michael.
There's so much I want to respond to in the last 10 minutes, but I'll try and stick to just a couple of things. I want to validate the point that I think we all have a largely congruent goal in mind. We all want to get to roughly the same place. And if it's a debate about strategy and tactics, that's really important. And I don't pretend to be an expert on the strategy and tactics of how to move people. But I think one thing that's really important to point out is there are different kinds of conversations, right? We are in a conversation that's about what's really true, what's reality about, a kind of a critical inquiry. This is kind of an academic conversation where our commitment is not to necessarily a position or a group of people, but what's real. And there's an ethos about that kind of conversation, right? And I think you've talked a lot about this in your work, which is really, I really appreciate that. You have to advance a certain level of trust with the people that you're talking about. You have to grant them a certain amount of, you have to assume that they're acting in good faith and hope they assume you act in good faith. I heard on one of your podcasts, you talked about bad faith, and I was very interested in that because I've been thinking a lot about bad faith. I think we are just bathing in bad faith right now, and it's really toxic.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to say that I just don't want to let slide is I've heard both of you, Heather and Bret, talk about bias and prejudice, and I think this is a really massive problem for us around these issues in America because we always want to personalize it and bring it down to the individual level of, well, this person has racist ideas or that person doesn't, so they're not racist and they're not having a racist effect in the world. As you learn more about this stuff, it's so important to understand institutional, structural, systemic racist things. You don't have to have racist thoughts to be participating in a racist dynamic that makes it worse for people of color. You don't have to be sexist to be perpetuating the domination of women. And we need to be more literate about that. That's part of the narrative we need. That's why this conversation is really important. We need to get better at identifying, oh, I'm not just being a dick, I'm actually keeping women down doing this, you know?
So I don't want to be a dick here. But the last part of what you said sounds unfounded to me. And I'm not saying that there are institutions out there that do still have discrepancies in regard to how they're treating different people based on their race. And I mentioned too before that not everywhere and not everyone, but policing and the courts have this problem, for sure. Okay, we know this. This is still the case in the United States. The idea that, for instance, college campuses are hotbeds of racism and sexism strikes me, I've never seen any evidence of it, and it strikes me as, frankly, laughable. And we fled the state because there was violence. So I'm laughing at the prospect that is where the seat of racism and sexism is. No, this is, as Bret has said many times, these are soft targets. And I don't think it serves anyone to be going after the soft targets where the people are actually more open and more interested in open discussion, discourse, conversation than anywhere else. Don't get rid of the liberal arts professors who are actually trying to engage with everyone and who are speaking across difference in class and race and gender and sexual orientation and ability and all of these things, and creating community. Don't create division there where there isn't any. That strikes me as what identity politics, I know for sure that is what identity politics results in sometimes some places, and it's now spreading outside of college campuses, and it's gripping the culture, and it's dangerous. Because, like I said before, identity politics begets identity politics. We're going to be in our silos.
Time is moving. Time is moving quickly, but I think that we'll likely have time to revisit this question about, where we emphasize the presence of structural racism, where we locate it, are we overemphasizing and so forth in certain areas and locating it in certain places where it may or may not belong. But I do want to pick up on this question of the rise of Trump and what many people are calling, more specifically, right-wing identity politics and its relationship to this environment that we're discussing here now. But rather than just ask the question, was the rise of, I'm not going to just say the alt-right, is the rise of the sort of political cultural forces that elevated Trump to the White House connected to the more left-leaning identity politics that we're kind of talking about now. But I also want to attach to that this question, if it is, in any way, what are some instincts you guys might have in terms of what kind of a counter-narrative, because I think there are instincts on both sides of our panel here, what kind of counter-narrative could we advance that could sort of call forth some understanding from people who feel so repulsed from some of the cultural signals they may be getting or perceive as coming from sort of the left side of things in our political conversation, that may be able to restore some good faith between the two sides. And let me just say very quickly that I get the sense that nobody up on this panel voted for Donald Trump. I'm just guessing. But I mean, even if you guys didn't, we very well may have people in the audience who did. I'm not asking anybody to out themselves. I'm just saying, we very well might have people in the audience who did, and you guys all probably have friends or relatives or associates who voted for Trump, who are, intelligent and kind and actually decent human beings. I'll go out on a limb and say that very well may be true. Probably is true. What's the relationship here, and what is the olive branch that can be extended to that side of the cultural universe in America to create some goodwill?
there's a lot in that question.
Yeah,
I think it's really important that we do this right, or at least start to. First thing is there's a bitter pill here. This is almost certainly a left-wing room. The bitter pill is Donald Trump is a political genius, and he played the left like a fiddle. So you have to understand what he did, and I must say I'm deeply troubled by the guy, and I find that his genius is based on the fact that he is, as far as I can tell, completely amoral, and there's no technology he won't play with in order to get where he's going. But what he did was he used certain themes that sowed division very effectively. And I'm going to point to one in particular that I think is haunting us to this day, and we need to realize we've been trolled, and we need to level up so that we can fight back against this process. And it has to do with MAGA, Make America Great Again. The problem with MAGA is the last A, okay? The last A is a double dog whistle. What that last A does is it divides us between people who have some point in history they want to go back to because it was pretty darn good, and people who know that to go back is to regress. So, right, he divided us over that thing. And when you talk to the good people that you're talking about, John, and there are good Trump voters, there are people who crossed over from Bernie to Trump because really what they were doing was voting against the establishment, right?
Or Obama to Trump, for that matter.
Yeah, well, there are people who voted for Obama twice and then went to Trump, and they were just looking for anything but the same old, same old. And so when you talk to those people, they often are confused by why the second A would be troubling to you. And really the question is, when is the period when it was great to be an indigenous American in this country? Have we gotten there yet? If we haven't, then the point is there's no place to go back to. There's no back. We can go forward. Maybe we can agree on making America great, but we can't agree to make it great again. That is an attack on certain people. And so anyway, realize the president has been trolling you since he started running for office, and he's still doing it. Stop taking the bait and get smart.
Just added one thing to that, that the dog whistle to the white nationalists is the one that's maybe most obvious to everyone, is the one that gets talked about, which is in fact a troll, of course. And what it misses then is that there are a whole lot of people who held their nose and said, you know what, I don't like that he's courting those people. I don't like that he's a sexist, gross guy, but he says he's going to drain the swamp. He says he's anti-establishment. He says he's actually going to give us a democracy back. I can't personally see believing that, but there are a lot of people who were so done that they were willing, even without being in any way racist or sexist, in any way, to say, I'm going to forgive him those disgusting sins because I think he stands a way of getting us out of this.
Michael or Robin, would either of you like to weigh in on this question of how we might go about, or how you might go about communicating with people who supported Donald Trump, but who you nevertheless might feel there's some common humanity there to reach out to?
Boy, that's a question I'm not sure I got anything for. But I do want to take up this question of, should we pin Trump's victory on identity politics in some way? That's really reeks of blaming the victim to me. There is that vein of American politics that Trump tapped into has been around forever. You can go back to the 1840s and 50s and the Know Nothing Party of anti-immigrant sentiment and intolerance and narrow-mindedness, and that's deep in America. And he may have been a political genius about how to use Twitter and mobilize these folks and hire Cambridge Analytica, but that's been there. And the other thing you got to talk about, first of all, I get really confused when people talk about the left in America, because I don't know where that is. I would love to see a left in America. I've never seen a left in my lifetime. A left would challenge the structure of capitalism we live under. It would at least try to domesticate capitalism so people aren't starving and living outside in a city like Portland, Oregon. I don't see people talk enough about that. And that, to me, is the real problem of the last election is the Democrats are handcuffed because we're in a political system where you have to raise gargantuan amounts of money, and then you're beholden to the people you raise the money from. And they're not pushing a Bernie Sanders agenda, much less a Michael Parkhurst agenda.
They are not handcuffed. They are voluntary captives. And the fact is, we don't have a party. So blaming identity politics is too simple. Blaming the Democrats is not too simple. The Democrats have sold out the left year after year because their assumption is we have nowhere else to go. And when people finally did go somewhere else, and the Democrats couldn't figure out why they had lost, maybe they began to get the message. But how many decades is this going to go on before they realize that they actually have to address the deeper issues that you're talking about if they want loyalty from the people that they're expecting it from?
I think an interesting thing to do right now might be, because the general subject here is still identity politics, right? And it goes in all of these different directions. But I think that all of our attitudes about identity politics probably has something to do with our attitudes about ourselves as individuals and how it is we may or may not be limited in terms of our ability to speak to or understand other people's problems by our own identities. You're right, by virtue of our own identities and our own backgrounds and so forth. Bret, I recall listening to you talk about, and we don't have to go into the details of the Evergreen debacle and so forth, you and have alluded to it in various contexts here. But though you've articulated critiques of identity politics in general, I do recall you in an interview talking about your experience at Evergreen, the initial episode that sort of prompted the later events, your opposition to the day of absence, wherein white students and faculty were asked not to come to school on a particular day, and you made the point that when people are told to vacate a shared space, as a person who is a supporter of the civil rights movement, who wants to protect the gains of the civil rights movement, you said in that interview that as such a person you were concerned whenever you saw people getting kicked out of a shared space, but that also as a Jew you were a person who was concerned when you see people getting kicked out of shared space. And when I saw that in sort of getting ready for this event here, I kind of paused at that point because I thought, there's Bret referencing his identity in the context of making a larger sort of cultural and policy point. And so I don't say that to pin you down. I just make that point to ask the panel, what are the ways in which we feel that we as individuals may be limited by virtue of our own cultural or socioeconomic experience in terms of how we can understand politics? What are the ways in which our own culture and identity sort of context allows us to understand issues? Where do the limitations lie and where do the limitations not lie in terms of how our own identities affects our ability to understand the world? Whoever wants it. I did call your name though, so you probably...
Yeah, you did call my name. So I think one of the things that Heather and I have discovered the hard way is that there is a landscape of terminology that doesn't function like normal words, where everything has at least two definitions, or worse, it has a definition and then mysterious properties that do not reference any definition. And so, words like equity that I thought I knew the definition of, it turns out I don't know the definition of that. But one of them that's relevant here is the term colorblind, right? Colorblind has now become a mark of shame. The idea that you would espouse colorblindness in public is troubling to people. It's almost like you're announcing that you are so, you lack self-awareness at a level that you don't even realize that you process other people's race when you meet them. This is not what colorblind means, right? Yes, there are people, rare ones, but there are people who will tell you they don't see people's race, they don't see color. But what colorblind actually means is it is an appeal to a structure that does not see your color. When you go into a courtroom or a classroom, that classroom should be indifferent to your color up until the point that it matters to some question. Now, sometimes it does matter to some question, where your color does say that you've had some experience that's relevant to the conversation in the classroom, in which case, by all means, bring it forward. When I referenced my Judaism on that podcast, and the one time I did it at Evergreen over email, it was relevant to the question. At Evergreen, I was told that as a white guy, I had experienced centuries of privilege and that I ought to shut up and listen. And my point was, no, not centuries of privilege. Personally, I have experienced privilege in this country. The U.S. has been very good to me. Up until May of last year, I experienced very little anti-Semitism in my life. It's been a weekly experience since then. But until that point, I had experienced very little, so it wasn't relevant to my experience as a person when I spoke to it. But we need to have a nation that functions in a colorblind fashion, which does not mean that it's indifferent to the experience that you've come from. It means that it functions in a way that is fair, that does not take that into consideration and harm you or privilege you above others based on it. It has to be indifferent. It's the only structure that's stable.
I think that there's a desire to get to the place where there can be colorblind systems, but I think that you have to acknowledge that the systems are not colorblind or unbiased or prescribing to patriarchy in order to even dismantle them and address them. So I think, yes, that's where we're desiring to go, but to even start down that path in a meaningful way, you have to acknowledge that it's not that way, that it is inherently systemically racist, sexist, and that those are real lived experiences that go back decades, like from the foundation of this country.
I didn't, before a day or two ago, I didn't expect to wind up quoting the Dalai Lama in this conversation. But he said something the other day. Maybe he tweeted it. Does the Dalai Lama tweet? Does anybody know? Or the Dalai Lama tweets, right? Man, it's a weird world we live in. And but he said something that seems kind of relevant to what it is we're talking about here tonight. He said, and I'm reading here, he said, I'm Tibetan, I'm Buddhist, and I'm the Dalai Lama. We can all relate to that, right? But if I emphasize those differences, it sets me apart and raises barriers with other people. What we need to do is pay more attention to the ways in which we are the same as other people. Now, so having read that quote, I would ask everybody on the panel, does that quote necessarily stand in opposition to how we believe we should be framing our political conversations? What is necessarily standing to opposition to the way we're sort of talking about identity politics here, or is there some way in which the ethic that he's articulating, that we should focus more on what is the same between us than what is different? Can that still harmonize with a way of approaching politics that does center our analysis around the experiences of our particular groups?
I'll just say, I appreciate the question, I appreciate the quote. What I find interesting is that he centered his individual identity and then named that it's important that we see our shared. And so I think that again, I'll go back to my personal experience and my personal belief that I truly find value in being able to step back and, again, whether it's in affinity, whether it's in caucus, as with people of color and communities of color in the Black community, with women, to really understand and unpack what are issues that are relevant and pertaining to me in again, whatever community I'm sitting with. And then what is the relationship to the larger, the drive or wherever we're going, and to be able to recognize where I have a shared connection or there is a shared vantage point and where there's not, and yet I can still link arms with you in the movement is really important to me. And to not be, and to not have that be a marginalizing conversation, but in a naming of where there is difference is, I think, of value, and being able to name the difference as a value. So again, I just thought it was interesting that he started with naming, I'm Tibetan, and these things, and then propositioning that we need to find our collective whole.
Does anybody else want to pick up on that question?
There's no time for a biology lesson here, but I would point out that we are haunted by our genomes and the objective that they hold for us, which nobody ever tells you. And that objective is the thing that sets these dynamics in motion. Your genome wants the spellings that it contains to be passed on in the greatest number And that means driving out alternative spellings, which can be predicted based on phenotypic differences that have no significance. So once you spot that that's what your genome wants, it's time to reject its hegemony over you, right? You become a person and you say, actually, I like Martin Luther King's dream better than that one. The genomic dream is not good. The Martin Luther King dream is pretty darn good, and it got written into our national ethos too late, but it's there now, and we need to protect it, because what will supplant it if we don't is that genomic drive to go up against the people who don't look as much like us as these other people and to align with them. So that's really my fear here as a biologist, is if we don't drive in an enlightened direction, we're going to get driven in a primitive direction, and it's not a good one. There's plenty in history to tell us how terrible it is.
Professor Weinstein, have you ever assigned that as a homework assignment to reject the genome's hegemony over?
Well, I know you're joking, but I do have to say, well, I was never big on homework. I wasn't big on homework when they assigned it to me, and I didn't do a lot of assigning it to my students. We got stuff other ways. But the students who protested at Evergreen were students literally to a person that I had never met. My own students were not protesting, and they all remained loyal. And there's a reason, which is that this topic was actually central to our discussion of evolution. This was not a secret. We talked about this, and we talked about the obligations that it imposes on us. It says, if you have to read this as some sort of a guide, take it as a warning, right? What the genes want is not honorable. It can't be defended. You have to reject it consciously.
Oh, Michael, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I guess I'll go back to the colorblind question and the Dalai Lama for a minute. You know, I think a huge part of my identity is I'm somebody who wants to understand the reality I live in, and I don't want to sleepwalk through it. And that is a core constituent element of who I am. And it's taken me a while to realize, like, that is just a central thing. And actually, it's cost me a bit, because my tribe is not the family I grew up in. And I am fairly different from the tribe that I grew up with. And we come from very different places and think very different things now, partly because of what I just described. And I think to weave together a few things we've talked about, you know, what's the way forward in terms of common dialogue? We need to move beyond the zero-sum framework of this, that if we elevate Robin's voice, that means you don't have a voice. I mean, that's ridiculous. And that is problematic. And what you two went through sounds miserable and terrible. And there was some really out of bounds behavior there. And I think we can all agree with that. But, you know, as I've started to pay more attention to how do these dynamics, and again, one of the things I want to make sure I say today, that I think power is just a critical thing in this conversation. Power is a solvent. You know what a solvent does? It takes the grime and the grit and the fuzz off of something so you can get to the thing. And when you're thinking about these questions, I think really focusing on who has power here is a really important question. And as I've thought about these things in terms of racial dynamics and other kinds of dynamics of oppression, I've learned more about the world, and I understand the world better. And that's why I don't think it's the way forward to just pretend the differences don't matter, or pretend that we can put it behind us. And there's, you know, we talk a lot about white privilege, and you know, the one I stumble over all the time is one I really want to reject. There's some white privileges I don't want to reject. I like the privilege that a police officer is probably not going to shoot me. That's a nice privilege. But the worst white privilege is ignorance. White folks get to wander through the world, mostly if they don't try, not thinking about this, not understanding this, never even wondering what is white mean and how did I get there. So that's a privilege I'm going to rigorously reject. And partly it's worked for me because when I listen to people of color, or I listen to women, or I listen to trans folks tell me about their experience, I learn things I never would have thought. And usually they're horrible things, not always, but I learned that the world is not what I thought it was. And I want to continue understanding what is that world and how do I get to a place where the trans person is just a person and has all the advantages I have.
We're getting close to the, I'm sorry, Heather, did you want
May I respond? I will never have to drive all black. That is a privilege that I was born with, that I did not earn, that I cannot give away, that I cannot hand over to anyone. I have observed myself benefiting from it, actually, in a moment when I was a teenager and I was pulled over along with 3 other cars who were speeding on Sunset Boulevard in LA. And one of those drivers happened to be black. And I watched it when I was 16. And when you have seen it and when you know you cannot ever experience it directly, you don't deny that it's real. Okay? However, the framing, and you didn't use these words, but the framing is one of, and many people do use these words, of those of us who are born with privilege that we did not earn and we did not choose and we cannot change, should have shame. And I think this emerges in part because wrongly, in different communities, gay people felt shame, were shamed. Black people felt shame, were shamed, women to some degree, etc., right? And the inverse of shame is pride. And so we have an emergence of movements towards being pride about immutable characteristics. Personally, I think that this is a mistake. I think that feeling pride or shame about something that you have no control over is the wrong way to use both of those extraordinarily powerful, universal emotions, that those emotions are drivers, are motivators of people, and that we should feel pride for doing good by others, for honoring the people around us and making the world a better place. I have no shame about being white. I certainly have no pride about being white. And I'm not saying that anyone shouldn't have pride about whatever they want, but I do think society-wide, the use of these two inverse emotions that really do have power as motivators would be better off reserved for things over which we have choice.
Do we want to address right now this question of whether or not there is, or perhaps whether or not there should be in some sense, a double standard? I don't want to prejudice this as sounding negative, but just it's a simple way of asking it. Should there be a difference in terms of celebrating pride in one's culture or one's ethnic origin and so forth for certain groups of people, particularly those who might be more underprivileged and more marginalized, in comparison to those who may not be white people, for starters? Do we want to? Can we address this question of is there a tension there, and how should we treat that tension? This idea that it's okay for a black person to be proud of being black, but it's not okay for a white person to be proud of being white.
I'd actually just like to take a step back, because as someone who, in the organization I work, we do anti-racist transformational change. I disagree that the goal of naming white privilege is to have folks feel shame about being white. That's definitely not something that we are advocating for. I certainly don't benefit from someone sitting in shame around being white. I think it's around being able to acknowledge our privilege. And I know I myself carry certain types of privilege with me, and there's really real power and benefit in being able to name how my privilege has shaped how I've navigated the world. I certainly haven't had a choice about, let's say, being more fair-skinned, having light-skin privilege. That's not a choice, that's something I was born with, and yet I can still acknowledge that I live in a world, in a society where I get preferential treatment in a lot of different ways and given the benefit of the doubt in a lot of different ways and shapes and forms. And I don't know, I can say maybe I've had like a brush up against shame around that, like, oh, I feel bad that that's unearned and unfair, and yet I don't stay there. I know that that doesn't serve the benefit. It's more beneficial for us to unpack what that means and how we can be aware of our privilege and choose to, again, decenter ourselves when we're the ones navigating with privilege. And so, again, just as someone who does the work consistently across the country, like, I have no, there's no value in me naming whiteness or white privilege as something to be ashamed of in any way, shape, or form. I think that it's a real reaction when we recognize how power and privilege have played out in our country, and yet I think that there's real power. For those of you who are interested, you could look up the cycle of empowerment. There's two of them. There's a cycle of empowerment for white folks, there's a cycle of empowerment for people of color, and it really is about getting to this collective action place where we can come together and link arms. And yet there is a place where we can be in a more shameful or negative space, but the goal is to move out of that into a more collective building space. So I do want to just name that in all my years of doing this work, I've never seen benefit in having someone sit with shame.
So there's a dynamic here I've never heard it described, so I think I'm going to take a crack at pointing it out. I don't hear anything from either of you two that I find deeply troubling. I think we do have differences of opinion about how to move forward, but basically what you're looking at here is a very civil disagreement by people who I'm going to assume are all on the left and are all interested in everybody having equal access to the value of society. But when I hear somebody put these things in these terms, I hear you say that you've never heard whiteness described as something to be ashamed of. I've sat in an auditorium and I've watched people shout about the scourge of whiteness with all these white people sitting in the audience trying to figure out how to feel about it. And so my point would just simply be, I often hear very articulate, well thought out, mild versions of things like equity and inclusion, and the part of me that, from before a year ago that hadn't yet seen where this train goes would have said, okay, that doesn't maybe sound like how I would go about it, but it's good enough. But I think the point is, once you start saying, hey, we can start talking about the problem of whiteness, then that thing it metastasizes into something that cannot be controlled. And in fact, it took over a college, it was wielding baseball bats, it really believed that there was a problem with whiteness itself, rather than there is a problem with white privilege, which has a history that we can talk about, and we can talk about how we will know when that privilege is finally gone, right? So it becomes something outside of your control that I think is very dangerous. So I don't think we're really talking about the problem of what you're saying. We're talking about the thing that is connected to it that doesn't know when to stop, and it does seek to shame.
And I do want to clarify really quickly. When I said I've never seen whiteness as a thing to be ashamed of, I'm saying in the trainings that I've done. I've never seen it perpetuated in a way wherever we've had a desire to have white folks sitting with shame.
And that works great as long as everyone is in good faith, right? So you said earlier that there's a lot of bad faith around. These systems are perfectly in game theory space. They're evolved systems. And all it takes is having a system that says, we will privilege you if you have these demographic markers. For someone to say, I've got those markers and I happen to be willing to go down this road because I'm interested in power or whatever it is. And you will have the bad faith players showing up and taking over. As opposed to if you say, okay, we need to address historic remnants of oppression and current instantiations of oppression, and we are going to do so with policy and proposals that are actually seeking full equality in the future, and we're going to allow people to have voice based on the value and the power of their arguments, based on merit, rather than based on demographic markers, because you can't game merit, but you can game demography.
Yeah, I think there's something really particular and special about the nature of academic politics, and it's been a while since I've been on a college campus, and I don't pretend to be an expert on what's happening on campuses now. And again, I want to validate that what happened to you guys was really deeply unpleasant and really out of bounds. But part of what happened was what is supposed to happen on college campuses. These are young people who are engaging these issues for the first time. They're trying out what does it mean to be politically engaged. They're trying to form arguments and engage with people, and they get excited. And I'm trying to say this without being condescending, but I'm getting to be a pretty old dude now. That, up to a point, is a beautiful thing, and that's what you want to see happen. And I said things in the 80s when I was a college student, and I look back now and I'm like, boy, I hope nobody wrote that down or put that down. I'm glad there wasn't Twitter then. That doesn't excuse shouting people down. That doesn't excuse threats and that sort of thing. But again, the power question to me is really clarifying. It's really different whether a 19-year-old college student calls you a racist or whether the U.S. Senate calls you a racist or whether a Fortune 500 CEO says, basically, get off my island. That's a really different thing.
Well, you will notice in the video that brought me to public attention, I'm not thrown by the fact that people are protesting. I am a little thrown by the fact that I don't know one of them. What threw me was the fact that they did not want to talk about whether or not they were right. They did not want to listen to my students who knew me, some of them for years, who wanted to talk to them about their assumption that I was a racist based on an email that's patently not racist, and based on a refusal to participate in a troubling structure in which some people are telling other people not to come to campus based on skin color. So anyway, I've protested, Heather's protested, we're not against that, and had they showed up and demanded to talk to me, is that really cool to shut down a college class because you want to talk about this thing right now? No, but I let them in the door. I went, they were chanting my name, I said, can I help you? Do you want to talk? And then they came in and they disrupted the thing and they didn't want to talk. That's the thing that really troubled me. There's something about the inability to hear, the desire not to hear, that is not the normal thing that you're talking about that should happen on a college campus.
And I think maybe even more to the point, college students, young people, everyone, but especially young people, are expected to resist structures that they've inherited that they see as wrong. This isn't good faith protest that we're seeing. This is not good faith protest. There are legions of good people, such as yourselves, patently, we just met this evening, but patently, right, who cannot match up what we are saying is happening with what you know to be in your heart of hearts, right? And I believe that that is true. But there were, in our particular case, and we know of hundreds of other examples, and there are organizations like Heterodox Academy and FIRE that are putting these together, that are collating the examples, in which students are not being educated but indoctrinated by manipulative faculty who are the bad faith actors who seize upon identity politics and rise in the ranks and accomplish whatever goals they have. In the particular case at Evergreen, they did so with the help of a corrupt administration. So you had students who were hapless, but who were the front line and who the world got to mock. And I feel the most bad for them because they were sent. They were sent by some bad faith players to do the work of these people behind the scenes who we can name, but we're not going to here. Right? This wasn't protest in the style of the 60s or the 70s, the 80s, or really up until even in Occupy, where things were beginning to look different, where people, the progressive stack meant that you weren't supposed to talk if you didn't have a certain number of oppression points. This was the beginning of that change, where now you can game that. The progressive stack allows people to game who gets to talk, and then it's not progressive anymore.
I'd like to. I'd like to ask us on the panel to self-reflect. I've noticed that Michael, Robin, you both seem to agree that even though you disagree with certain things that Bret and Heather are saying, some of the ways in which they're conceptualizing identity politics, you both seem to agree that it is possible for people for whom their identity is important and animates their political activism to go too far. and that going too far has consequences, even if a person maybe might overemphasize those times in which it happens, or pretend it's a bigger problem than it is. My question is, what are your instincts as people who not only believe in the importance of equity and inclusion, but also believe in the validity of a cultural identification animating one's political and social activism? What are your instincts in terms of how you guys, or people who think as you do about these issues, what are some things that such people can do to prevent these excesses from defining other people, like yourselves, I would imagine, in Bret and Heather's opinion, for whom, these more kind of objectionable sort of descriptions don't really apply? Big question.
I don't know for sure that this answers your question, but I'm an alum of Reed, and Reed has gone through its own version of this kind of process. And I only really know what I read in the newspaper there and some of the other press accounts. But one of the things that was interesting is I think there was a similar dynamic where there was a group of hardcore folks who were going to disrupt classes and really sort of try and make the campus talk about this. Again, there's a teachable moment there Reedy's learned something in this process, and maybe it was really unpleasant, and maybe people did things I wouldn't do, but it was a learning experience. Maybe people learned, let's not do that again, I don't know. But one of the things that really struck me that was interesting is students started to speak up and say, hey, we're paying a lot of money and going to a lot of trouble to go to this class. And students of color said, really don't appreciate you interrupting my physics class. What you're saying is really important, and I do want to talk about that, and let's talk about it when I'm not in physics class. And I'm not in the business of putting boundaries on what people of color ought to do or what activists ought to say and when they ought to say it, but I think there's a way to structure more civil discourse, and we need to figure out how to do more of that. At the same time, I think, there are different political tactics and there are different theories of social change, and social change doesn't always get furthered in polite, discursive situations like this. Sometimes it's, we're going to stop the train, we're going to stop the bulldozer, and then we're going to have a real conversation. And maybe that's what it takes, and I'm not willing to rule that out entirely.
Robin, do you want to pick up on this question of how we, in particular, folks who may share you and Michael's general perspective about these issues might influence other people who may be tempted to take things in maybe a too aggressive manner, to sort of act in a way that's more constructive? In your work, do you have a sense as to how best to influence people in a more constructive direction in that way?
So when I think about kind of the variety of ways, and Michael, I think that this is a little bit of what you're saying, is that there are a lot of ways to come at political or social movements, and that I generally come from a place where inviting multiple perspectives, inviting multiple ways of engaging in these types of conversations is of value, and I think that there are times where being more disruptive is a value add. There are times where having a more, calm, collective panel of folks presenting is of value, and I want to be really thinking and mindful about how we're valuing those perspectives and those approaches. And I think that I don't think that there's any one right way or another. What comes up for me when I hear about people being really disruptive and maybe not willing to engage in a discussion, the part of me that's curious is, I'm curious around, why are they feeling unseen, unheard, and which took them to that extreme? And I think that, again, systemically, there is a lot that pushes us to a tipping point where there is nothing but to be disruptive. And so what can we do? Where can we create spaces where people are being disruptive and we are able to or willing to pause to invite the conversation forward? And maybe it is honoring a request to stop a class, stop some sort of, political movement in order to center voices in which they feel like being disruptive is the only way they're going to be heard. I know that can be really extremely challenging. I myself, as a conflict avoidant person, I kind of cringe when I think about, but I also recognize that even in, again, I'll just reference the Black community, I tend to do a lot of work more behind the scenes on policy and practice and how to engage across communities and within community about how to move the movement forward, move the narrative forward. And yet I know that there are people in my community who physically put their bodies on the line, whether it's a sit-in, whether again maybe it's something more disruptive. And I truly value the person who, and there's all the in-betweens, but I really value the people who put their bodies on the line. And that's not the space I find myself most often in, but I want to be able to recognize there's lots of ways to move conversation forward. There are lots of ways to interrupt systemic oppression, and we need to really value and honor them all and find ways in which we can be responsive to what's happening.
And Bret and Heather, I'd like to ask you both to self-reflect on a certain issue. So the two of you are both members of an elite club, which has come to be known across, vast swaths of the wilderness of the internet as the intellectual dark web. But I mean, it's you guys are folks who have come to a certain level of prominence and complain in public conversation around these issues because of stands that you've taken and so forth. But there does seem to be there's a culture, I suppose, that's developing in and around the IDW, the intellectual dark web, or whatever we can label it. And there's certainly a culture of criticism, I think, that's forming around it, where people look at folks, and I'm just naming names because everybody knows the names already, so I don't think it's inappropriate to do so, but criticisms of people like Dave Rubin and like Jordan Peterson and others who could be named, and even of the two of you, as being people who are articulating points that somehow or other do not take into account the very sort of the very fundamentally sort of race-based nature of the problems that impact our society, marginalized communities, in particular the identity-based nature of problems that impact communities, marginalized communities in particular. And they feel that the conversation is laser focused on protecting free speech, but not protecting vulnerable people. And so my question of self-reflection for the two of you is, I know that clearly you guys would disagree with that assertion, but looking at the way the conversations have unfolded within the realm of the intellectual dark web and the associated channels and programs, whatever that entails, are there ways in which that conversation can potentially be shifted so as not to give any ground on the principles that are so important to you two and to the others that you fight to defend, but to also make clear that you are actively concerned with some of these problems that your critics are concerned with as well, as opposed to merely reactively responding to them after being called out for supposedly not caring?
So I'm waiting for Eric to explain the term intellectual dark web to take a little bit of the pressure off, because everybody seems to have...
It's your brother's fault, right?
Yes, well, he did choose the name, but anyway, let's put that aside for the moment. So I don't think it is true that we have not addressed these issues. I've heard myself address them multiple times. The question of what the evolutionary background of systemic oppression is, where it comes from, what would have to be true in order to correct it in a permanent and stable way. These are things on which I've been focused for a couple of decades now, and as I've been cast into the spotlight, I have talked about these things on many podcasts. I've also challenged other members of the intellectual dark web, who I think, frankly, some of them are a little deaf to these issues, but that's the nature of this thing. And I do want to just place in your minds what I'm increasingly understanding this phenomenon to be. People keep looking for the thing that will allow them to dismiss it, right? What is it? Well, it contains some folks who are pretty far to the right, so it's really kind of a right-wing organization, isn't it? Well, no. Half the people in it are actually left of center. I'm really far left of center, so is Heather. So why would this entity that was right-wing contain a couple of people who are really far left of center? Because it isn't about ideology. That's the point. What this really is about a recognition that the systems that we are dependent on are decohering. They are failing. The agreement that we used to have about basic values like presumption of innocence and equal protection under the law, being judged by the content of your character, our agreement around these things is breaking down. And what that means is that there are a bunch of us who can't agree on much at all. I don't agree with Ben Shapiro on much, really, right? But we do agree that those values rise above everything else. And until we've shored them up and secured them, that's what we need to talk about. So what is bringing people from pretty far right and pretty far left together in the center? It is the need to discuss the basic values that unite us so that they are not lost in the noise. That's what we're doing. That's why there is an intellectual dark web. So if I can just pitch it to you, please, wherever you stand, join us in the center so we can talk about those important things.
I don't really want to add to that.
Well, you don't have to if you don't want to.
No, I guess there's one thing I can say. I can't speak for the IDW, right? There's no single voice, and this is what Bret's saying. We're first principles thinkers who value the methods and the tools of analysis and logic and reason and science above the conclusions that we have already come to, and are fundamentally willing to change our conclusions in the face of contravening evidence. And so I do think that to the degree that one has to acknowledge, once you're an adult, that you can't simply maximize everything. Do I, as just as me, not as a member of some group, but do I think that privileging historically marginalized voices is the most important value? No, I do not. I do not. It is a value. It is a value. But the understanding what is true through Enlightenment values, the scientific method specifically, will allow us to know what is actually true in society, and what changes as we make them are actually effective in changing the inequities that do still exist. So it is a privileging of reason over conclusion.
You started talking about first principles, and I think that it would be good for us to end there, assuming we have one more question available to us before Q&A. Do we have time for one more for the panel? I don't even know who I'm looking at. Where is it? Hey, y'all are dark. I didn't mean that in... Well, you get it. It's the lights, right? I don't see anybody telling me not, so I'm just going to throw out one more. And it's such a simple question that nobody ever asks, I think. And maybe it just seems like it should be self-evident to people, but, I'm not sure that it is. You guys have disagreed here tonight in what I think is, all in all, has been an admirably civil way. And I think that, we wouldn't be here tonight. Bridging Our Divide wouldn't be doing this if they and we didn't feel like that was an important example to set. My question for the panel is whether we're talking about people who are way to the left on the identity politics spectrum or way to the right on the, I don't know what you would say, the nationalistic, side of the argument or the conservative side of the argument. What things have to be true of a person who disagrees even fundamentally with the way you formulate your political and social worldview? What things have to be true about that person on a moral level that could transcend those intellectual differences to allow you to not only interact in a loving and charitable way with that person, but even to work with that person towards a constructive end to the point to which your common humanity might allow you to? What are the first principles? Well, that's a good answer. You're not on the panel, but I like your answer. No, but that's a good point. What are the fundamental moral characteristics that will allow us to, to push on past the things about which we stridently disagree?
You have to be willing to change your mind. That's one. That's not all, but that's what comes to mind first.
That's a great start. I mean, absolutely. That's just a core thing. And I think I agree with Bret. We used to know how to do this maybe a little bit better. We used to know what evidence meant and what a warrant for your argument meant and how to build an argument. And now we live in a universe where people have different data sets and different realities. And that's completely terrifying to me. And I think one of the things that I've noticed really clearly is if you start a political conversation with someone you don't know well at the level of policy, you're either going to get agreement or the conversation is just going to go into the ditch immediately. And to reach across the divide, I guess, to do what this group is trying to do, you have to start with values and find out, do we share values? And I'm not sure I can take it as a given that we do in a broad sense across as much of America as I thought we did. But let's start with values. Do you believe every individual has dignity and worth? And if you don't, then we're going to have a different kind of conversation. But if you agree with that I can build on that. We can go somewhere positive if we agree on that very basic thing.
Any other takers? Robin or Heather?
Sure. So I want to extend one rung beyond be willing to change your mind, which is you should also, just in your own free time, figure out what it is that would change your mind if you encountered it on every topic, right? What would tell you that the Earth wasn't going around the sun? It's a pretty high bar, but you should know what it is that would tell you that if you saw it. And if you do that exercise, then in conversation you'll be much better about recognizing when somebody else has really alerted you to something you didn't know. That's one thing. Good.
And it allows you to spot bad faith arguments when they show up too.
Right, and as you mentioned, I've said this before, bad faith changes everything. A conversation in which bad faith exists just does not have the potential to do what we're doing here and what you're advocating, John. So I would also say there is, this is something that I've been doing. I didn't even know why I was doing it for years. I always set as an exercise, maybe even just for the intrigue of it, to try to hear people that I'm not supposed to be able to hear. Right? I'm an evolutionary biologist, but I actually like it when the Jehovah's Witnesses come to my door and they want to talk to me. And
You invite them in without fail.
I do. I let them in, and I alert them right away. I say, look, you got your work cut out for you. I did once hand them a copy of The Selfish Gene, which they brought back 2 weeks later, a little befuddled by it. But the point is, I have those conversations with them, and you would be shocked at how good those conversations can be. And this also works in the classroom, and it's quite a beautiful thing if you have a classroom in which you have enough room to do this, right? Where you really, the language I use inside myself is to look past somebody's user interface into who they actually are. It doesn't matter if they're trans, it doesn't matter if they're foreign, it doesn't matter if they're a different color. You can see past it. It doesn't mean those things don't have implications for the person you're talking to, but that person is, inside that they're not seeing their color, right? They've lived it, but you can reach them, you can hear them, and when you reflect back something that tells them that they've been heard, it opens all kinds of doors. So anyway, I think this is a great thing to do. It's extremely rewarding, and it will make you able to have conversations that other people have difficulty having, which is a great way to spend your time here on Earth.
Robin, would you like to close us up?
Yeah, I am really appreciating just this panel and even hearing what folks would need or are looking for in order to hear one another. And I know for me that I think that there's a piece around being able to see our shared humanity that's really critically important. And in order for me to even engage in a conversation with someone that may be okay, we're clear we're not in the same place, but if we can agree in our shared humanity, that's a great starting place. And I think the second thing for me that's really important in being able to engage in that conversation, and this is an area that I just work on being stretched in myself, is not necessarily be willing to change my mind. I think that can be an element of what I'm about to say, but actually for me it's being able to try on a different perspective. So even if I don't, it doesn't result in my mind being changed, but my willingness to really go there and being able to sit with their different perspective, and if someone is telling me how they're experiencing the world or how they're impacted by A, B, or C, for me to really accept that as truth, and just understanding is that there's multiple truths happening in any given dynamic. And so to be able to engage in a conversation, and so there's in that, if I recognize someone is willing to try on a different perspective, it also invites me to try on a different perspective as well.
And I think that's a good place to leave. Ladies and gentlemen. I think this has been just the type of conversation we wanted to have. So thank you guys so much. And now we want to hear from you all, from the audience. And I think we have, 20 minutes or 30 maybe? 20? Okay, we have 20 minutes. We have microphones on this end and that end. So I guess we need people to just sort of calmly line up, and we'll do our best to get to as many people as we can. Do us a favor. Feel free to tell us your name. Full-length autobiographies should be discouraged because we're limited on time. But your name, quick compliment if it's your statement if you must, but then concise question would be appreciated.
You said 20 minutes each?
So, for you got that kind of time. We got a plane to catch tomorrow.
Yeah, I got a few too. But
Shame, powerful. I would have liked to hear a little more.
What's your name, by the way?
My name's Jameson. Very kind of brown. Grew up mostly in a white world. When Mexicans talk to me in Spanish, I don't know. But yeah, I forget that I'm brown sometimes. But other people. So a couple of things. So I tend to be really against identity politics and much more first principles. But I would have liked to hear the first principles people address the problem that the identity politics people are trying to fix. And you mentioned it, and I'd like to spend more time there in terms of how do you recommend elevating those voices? And I would also bring back the shame issue. I think what I've seen so much of is that shame being put out there, and some people respond with shame, and I think that does beget more, I forget how you said it, but more division. You know, I've heard a black comedian in Portland say,
but so I hear you asking, can the identity, can the people who are defending free speech address the concerns that the identity politics people are raising?
yeah, you have solutions.
Yeah, what are the
we didn't hear them
solutions?
tonight.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of generally bumped up on that topic and the self-reflection portion, but Brett, Heather, I think that's for you guys. Would you like to hit that one very quickly?
Sure. You have to understand the connections between things before you go about figuring out how to solve them. We don't have time to do this in the Q&A here, but if you think about the fact that we have an economic system which actually seeks to address inflation by maintaining a level of unemployment. Mm-hmm. That level of unemployment is not evenly distributed across society. It is more concentrated in black neighborhoods than other neighborhoods. What is the result of having not enough opportunity? Well, it's not a big leap to imagine that it results in an increase in crime, which then results in an increase in incarceration. What does an increase in incarceration do? If it is males who are being incarcerated disproportionately, it undercuts women's bargaining position in the mating and dating market. So they have a harder time keeping a man to raise a child with because that man has lots of opportunities since there's a deficit of men in those communities. Then white society looks at that and it blames black people for some sort of deficit of family values, which is really much more likely the consequence of some systemic bias in the way opportunity is allocated. Once you understand that, then the question is, well, is there a way to infuse opportunity into communities that have been frozen out of that opportunity? It is, after all, our obligation, if we are going to maintain a level of unemployment in order to keep inflation down, that we deal with the people who couldn't find a job, not because they were lazy, but because there weren't enough jobs, because we decided there shouldn't be. So that's about what that conversation would sound like. And then once you're there, it's really a policy question.
Yes. I'm moving to the left. Literally, not figuratively. All right, brother, go ahead. What's your name?
In 2016, a multi-day riot played out.
What's your name, Pat?
Similar to Bret's name.
Okay.
In 2016, a multi-day riot played out in the city of Portland after the election of Donald Trump. One of those nights, the riot took course down the center of the Pearl District, where mass participants smashed windows of locally owned and immigrant-owned businesses. Eyewitness participants of the riot tagged hammer and sickles and ideological phrases on walls and windows in the district. One of the phrases that tagged on the walls that caught my eye was, quote, "Liberals get the bullet too." What should I think of this, and how does this stated goal intersect with your understanding of identity politics?
Okay.
Do you need me to repeat the quote?
Do you have? Do you have one side of the panel or the other, or we want to tackle it?
Open question.
Open question. Okay.
I'll take a quick swing at this.
Sure.
I'm not sure it has anything to do with identity politics. I don't think every leftist...
The Pearl District wasn't picked.
Can I finish
No
talking?
identity. Just strong answer.
Well, let's
I'm going to try to make the response really concise. I don't think every leftist or every person of color should be held responsible for what a couple of folks do. I think we all know a lot about how politics in this country works and have heard the term provocateurs. So I don't take it on good faith that those were leftists doing that. That's an open question. Maybe they were. Maybe they're really confused people. Maybe they're people that I don't want to necessarily claim those people. So
I got the website that's going down.
Okay, let's let Michael answer the question. If we have more time, we can do a big back
I'm
and
not
forth.
sure I see a connection. I'd be open to hearing more about that, but that's not the most interesting phenomena going on in America to me. But I'd love to talk more about that if you want to.
Did I have another follow-up over here?
Yeah, just one sentence. I think to the extent that this is an observation that is suggestive of what, I think what you're suggesting is that identity politics will continue to get smaller and smaller and smaller as it gains power and kick others out. So, liberals get the bullet, was that the phrase?
That was the phrase.
Liberals
The
get the
quote
bullet
was
too?
liberals get the bullet too.
Right. So, in a system that doesn't have protection against the bad faith actors from gaming it, they will claim to be all-inclusive at first, and then over time start kicking out marginalized groups within a community that claimed to be trying to protect marginalized groups.
All right, we got 15 minutes. Okay, back to the right. By the way, you don't have to say your name if you don't want to. I said that a moment ago, but if you don't want to, it's fine. But feel free to if you like.
Given that I feel like this has been a really great discussion, you guys have done an awesome job at being inclusive and all that stuff. My name is Alec. You're welcome, and that's important. I don't come from a place that that is left like Portland tends to be. So fast forward to my question. I'm not sure who's best to answer this, so I'll leave it open. I'm a philosophy minor, and I've done a lot of work in philosophy. One of my favorite quotes is from a man named Wittgenstein, and he writes a lot about the philosophy of language, and I think that's important because in everything that we're talking about, there is the use of language, and especially rhetoric, right? There's words that come up, they're used, and you have to know that lingo in order to participate in a conversation in an accessible way. So the quote is, philosophy is the struggle against the bewitchment of our minds through the means of language, right? There's this idea that language has a way of sort of subtly persuading and shifting the way that we think, not exactly with our noticing it.
This is a great setup. Let's
so my question is, how do we sort of create a common understanding by having an established language without becoming beholden to that language without our own recognition of that?
That's deep. Who wants it?
So Wittgenstein's a good start. What he's getting at is that essentially a disciplined use of philosophy allows you to escape these traps. And I think this is actually, it's quite a good question, because what we're seeing with all of the terms that are now being tossed about that one cannot define, or one finds they have two definitions, all of these things are creating a foreseeable catastrophe in our dialogue. They make it impossible to be rigorous because you don't know which version of a term you're talking about when you invoke it. So anyway, I would say it's possible to be overly obsessed with language, but one does at least need to have the rules established so that you can use it properly to have a dialogue like this. And that makes it very healthy. You'll be surprised how much agreement you'll get. People do overwhelmingly agree on good values. They don't always agree on the priority of them. If you get them to say which one's top, they will disagree. But most of us agree on the basics, and that's a good start.
Okay. Okay, this way.
Hi, Danielle, and I just have a clarification, exposition, but I think I can wrap it into a question. And it's for Heather regarding the comment that there's not sexism on college campuses. I went to Michigan State, which I was on campus that I had to prevent rape for myself, and is also the home of Larry Nassar. So not great. And yes, I get that those are antidotes, or stories. But we had the Missoula crisis, and we had the Obama Dear Colleague letter, and we have 1 in 5 girls on college campuses are victims of sexual assault. Either that's not evidence, or that's not sexism, or you're thinking something different, and I just wanted some clarification.
I appreciate it. There's a lot of places to go here. Sexism and racism exist everywhere. I meant to say, if I wasn't clear, that they are less common on college campuses than elsewhere, and I do believe that that is true. To the extent that rape is apparently more common on college campuses than elsewhere in society, there's good evidence that is suggestive of, to get back to the Wittgenstein question actually, varying standards of definitions of rape and sexual harassment. And I am not suggesting that people are not assaulted. I am not suggesting that people aren't raped, but it is all of our responsibility to prevent rape, women and men alike, all of us. And yes, those things happen on college campuses, but in general, college campuses are at the forefront of trying to prevent sexual assault. They are leading the charge, I would say.
Okay. We have 10 minutes left. Want to get at least a couple more.
My name is Stephanie. I'm a scientist by training. In fact, I was a colleague of your brother Eric's at MIT. I also defeated a 36-year incumbent in a district of 1 million people. So I know something about practical politics. And practically, people don't vote on full information. And it's not realistic to think that we will ever get to a point where they do. My question is, given that, where do we, can we hold in our minds at the same time the scientific approach? Yes, we want to collect evidence and have a science-based approach. Can we hold that at the same time in our minds with, yes, people vote on identity and emotion, and to make progress, it is impractical to ignore that. Can we unify these 2 points of view?
I think we do through narrative, right? We need stories that are based on truth. We know those of us who are scientists who like numbers and who like graphs and statistics and such have a little bit of a hard time understanding why not everyone loves them. and not everyone's is
Yes,
compelled.
it's worth understanding that and listening to them and really understanding it in the way that Robin describes, sitting
Right.
with them and understanding that
but
because
this-
there are so many of us.
But this is what I'm saying, that the vast majority of people don't care about the numbers. And so we're trying to transform people's minds about something, let's just take it out of the realm that we've been in so far, but about anthropogenic climate change. And, parts per billion is not going to compute with people. They're just not going to care, right? We need narrative that is based on truth, and the truth needs to be based on science.
So I would just add, Orwell was a brilliant political theorist, and he was also brilliant with narrative. The political theory stuff is pretty deeply buried, but the fact that we have access to 1984 and can reference it in common parlance does a tremendous amount of good. And when those impulses emerge, we have something shared that we can reference. So I think that's what Heather is getting at. You learn it through the analysis, the dispassionate analysis, but you convey it and we share it through narrative. And so it can be done, but we need people to be writing those stories.
Okay, this way.
Hi, my name's Eric. I have a question about individualism. I'm very passionate about self-ownership, and I'm curious about how identity politics, is it compatible with individualism, or does it drive a wedge between us?
Michael, Robin, do you guys have a...
Can you define self-ownership?
Like, we're each our own person, and we own like what we produce with our labor, and we have like a natural right to preserve ourselves and live our lives as long as we aren't harming people.
Yeah, is there a
Liberty.
contradiction between that ethic, that individual ethic, that ethic of individual sovereignty, right, and identity politics of the type that we've been talking about here today, where we look at our group identity and frame and pursue our political interests through that? Well, so it's open for anybody who wants to take a stab at it.
No, go ahead.
This is really just my perspective, kind of off the cuff. I think that, I know folks who don't feel necessarily connected to a community, right? As a Black person, they say, I don't subscribe to that community, that's not my community, I am my own person, I am me, and that's, and I think that there, again, I think from multiple perspectives, there's space and can be value in that. I'm a heavily community-oriented person, and that's not necessarily right or wrong. And I think there's an element of this concept or theory around identity politics that sits well for me, but it doesn't. For me, I don't see it necessarily as a wedge between the person who needs to be the individual. I do think that there's value in being able to hold both truths, and I think that that can be the challenge, because I think in our society we want it to be one or the other, that there's a right or a wrong, or there's a black or a white in there, and I just don't know necessarily that there is. I do think that when we're talking about again, systems and institutions that operate in a way that perpetuate certain privileges and other folks being oppressed, we have to be able to acknowledge that. But I don't necessarily inherently being a wedge. I think it's around how can I acknowledge and value your perspective in the larger work.
Okay. We still have a little more, about 5 more minutes, so over to this side.
Hi, my name is Ben, and my question is, you guys have all, I believe tonight, self-identified as progressives. Everyone believes in that notion of, the world progressing, things getting better. Bret, you talked about how, it used to be you go to school, there were no gays, not because there were no gays, but because they couldn't come out as being such. And this has all come out of the, typically is looked at, it's traditionally been looked at, and I think you've made the case pretty well tonight, that has come out of the use of reason and the use of arguments and not appealing to, the genes, the baser genes, and trying to look at the broader humanity, even though it goes against the biology. And my question is attacking on that and criticizing that, and we see things now with, like you brought up with, I mean, I've seen it in class. I studied archaeology, anthropology, and I saw it in cultural anthropology and stuff like that, where they would even say, reason is racist, or is no better than, or science is no better than superstition, things like that. Is this not, in a way, killing the goose that lays the golden eggs?
Yeah, I think you answered your own question. Science is the ultimate bullshit detector. If you think we suffer from a problem with bullshit in society, science is the answer. If you think that there's a problem with bias and you want to detect it, science is the way to prove it. So anyway, there's a reason that some of us adhere to it, and it's not because we're indifferent to the human dimension. It's because we want to see the human dimension done right.
Okay. Back to this side of the room.
Thank you, Jane. I am so appreciative of the conversation. My name is Joel. I'm going to do this so well and so short. So these conversations are so important, but they are bridging a very interesting divide where the discipline over here is science, you're scientists, you're rational, you're binary, it's one or the other, and you are community builders and community integrators and visionaries about very mungy stuff. So I ask the left side of the room, we're not talking about things political, Heather, how can you improve the way these dialogues work so that you guys could get used to disclosing things that people on this side are comfortable with, such as confirmation bias, privilege, and other things, and function in a less binary world that is the political world? I'm failing at being short here. And then follow up on this side, how can you guys speak more rationally?
A little bit loaded on the back end there. Well, then maybe.
No, I was going to say, I was with you for the first half.
Yeah. How you want to take it?
I object to the characterization of science and scientists as binary. And I think this is actually a classic misunderstanding that emerges from people who were exposed probably to bad math and physics teachers in high school and who have less experience with the more emergent life sciences where complex systems exist, and we're talking about populations with variation. So there are things that are binary, that are dichotomous out there, but for the most part, in the messy, gooey world of biology, things are actually highly variable and quite interesting. And so I think that is exactly why we are in actually this middle space of saying we're going to use analysis and the scientific method, which involves making observations and positing as many hypotheses as we possibly can to figure out what we think they mean, and then figuring out what the predictions would be that would necessarily fall from them, and then go out and test them, and therefore not be data-driven, because that's not science, but be hypothesis-driven.
Can I vary it from binary?
Well, you know what? We've got to move on to the next person because we've literally just got 1 minute left, and I want to get one person in very, very quickly, my friend. Go ahead, close us out.
I think our society has become very attuned to hearing and seeing when rhetoric becomes not just right but far right, even to the point where we have many, many false positives. I'm wondering, when does the left go too far? Tonight, I found it very illuminating that Ms. Johnson tried to point out some of the, I guess, maybe redeeming qualities of some of the actions of the radicals, activists at Evergreen. And to me, I think if that is not too far, then I wonder at what point does it become? I named you, but it's...
So you're asking at what point does identity politics go too far, basically, if the incident at Evergreen is not an example of that? I'm not sure that that's what was being claimed, but could you crystallize that for us a little bit more?
Yes, I guess my frustration is people say like it goes too far when there's violence or intimidation, but that's a generic answer. We need to, I want to like, we see it, we are so focused on noticing it when it happens on the right, but on the left, at least on the university campus, it's like pretty much anything goes, and frequently violence is condoned as well.
Okay, gotcha. So is that a question for Michael and Robin?
I don't have it for anyone in particular.
Okay, so whoever wants to whoever wants to close us out on that one, when is too far too far? Just plain and simple. Is it at the line of violence, or is there another line prior to that is the sort of, that's the red line that we don't want to cross in a civil society?
So I don't know how to do it generically either, right, Andy? But I do have another example that's not evergreen, that didn't involve violence, I don't think, that strikes me as very obviously having gone too far, and in some ways is the first example on campuses that really came out into public, which was what happened at Yale with Nicholas and Erica Christakis. And so very, very briefly, an administrator sent an email suggesting to students that they not be culturally appropriative in their Halloween costumes. And Erica Christakis, who's a child development expert, probably getting her field wrong, responded. She was also a master of the college, sort of overseeing residential students, said, maybe consider always having respect, but also don't feel that you have to honor this fairly authoritarian dictate from this other administrator of the college. The students rallied, they got furious. She had in fact said, at no time should you be disrespectful to other people's cultures, but perhaps you should be allowed some latitude. We jump forward, I think it's a year and a half later. It was last spring, indeed, right around when the Evergreen protests were erupting, that the student who led the protest at Yale was graduating and was given Yale's highest honor for I'm going to get the language slightly wrong, I'm sure, but for basically creating a culture of good race relations on campus. That went too far. Right, and that has been confused by Howard Dean of all people, a former presidential candidate who saw the snapshot of that and said, "Oh, those racist faculty should never have weighed in." And we, in the wake of this, now know these people, and they are not the racists, right? Nicholas and Erica Christakis are not the racists at Yale. That is an example of something that went too far.
It goes too far when you start dehumanizing the opposition.
Okay. And ladies and gentlemen, I think that closes us out right. Once again, round of applause for yourselves, for our panelists. And if you are interested in seeing more of these kinds of conversations, let me ask you to give us your email address at Bridging Our Divide. The table is in the back of the room. And if you want to see more groundbreaking dialogues like this and be a part of the solution, please consider giving our friends a donation so we can continue this good work. And so once again, appreciate you guys. And we're looking forward to next time. All right. Good night, folks. Thank you all so much.
Bridging Our Divide is a non-profit organization. We depend on your support to continue hosting dialogue events and common ground debates. So please consider visiting our website and making a donation to help us host new events in new areas around the country.